On our earth, before writing was invented, before the printing press was invented, poetry flourished. That's why we know that poetry is like bread. It should be shared by all, by scholars and by peasants, by all our vast, incredible, extraordinary family of humanity. That was Pablo Neruda. I'm Bob Holman, and this is the Poetry is Bread podcast, where poetry challenges us, makes us think, and with imagination and courage, changes the world. Visiting with us today, the wonderful poet Dante Micheaux, the author of Amorous Shepherd from Sheep Meadow Press, and Circus, which won the Four Quartets Prize from the Poetry Society of America and the T.S. Eliot Foundation. His other honors include the 2020 Ambit Poetry Prize and fellowships from Cave Canem and the New York Times Foundation. Recently, he became the director of programs for Cave Canem, and he's just informed us that he's living these days up in the Berkshires at the Amy Clampett residency. Welcome,
Thank
Dante
you so much,
Micheaux.
Bob. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you. So, listen, we start off this way with most of the guests here. What is it? How did poetry come to you? What poem or poet was it that made you think that poetry was more than a pastime?
That's a good question. I mean, poetry came to me before I discovered that poet, but I'd have to say something really that probably many people say, which is Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. That's really struck me when I was in high school. It started a love of reading poetry. And then the year after I encountered that, I met the great Sonia Sanchez. She came local and gave a reading at the public library.
Where were you at this point?
I was in high school. I was in high school in Princeton, New Jersey.
Okay.
Yeah. And she came, she had just published a book called Wounded in the House of a Friend. And she read at the public library, and she read a poem that really just changed my whole outlook. At the time, the poem, and in the book, the poem is entitled Improvisation 17, but she has since retitled the poem, and she calls it her Middle Passage poem. She read this poem about the voyage across the Atlantic, and she was the first person I ever met who was a poet, who was a tried and true poet, and demonstrated that it was something you could do with your life. I mean, I knew all the other poets I knew were dead who I read in school.
A living poet,
yeah,
right
she was a
in
living
front of
poet.
you. And from her was spewing a living poem. And Sonia, nobody can get a poem across like she can.
Nobody can get a poem across like she can. So yeah, I was just talking to her the other day, and all that time she'd just been in Philadelphia, which isn't that far from Princeton, and had no idea. But yeah, that poem, if you get a chance to look back through your books, it's in Wounded in the House of a Friend, and it's called in that book, it's called Improvisation. It's a very powerful poem. Probably the most powerful poem about the Middle Passage that I've ever read. It's certainly in league with Haydn's Middle Passage poem, and Elizabeth Alexander's Amistad. But this one is just just the voices of the people.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
Wow. Well, yeah, it's not that familiar a story, Walt Whitman and Sonia Sanchez, but we can go along with that couple. But there's not every poet who comes here who has the name of a poet for his name. How did that come about?
Well, that's an interesting story. Most people think that I changed my name so that I could sound more poetic, but in fact, when I was 13, I had read the Divine Comedy in school, and came home one weekend and said to my mother, with the book, waving my copy in front of her, saying, "Why didn't you tell me I'm named after the most famous poet of all times?" And by that time, at age 13, I'd probably written 5 poems, let's say. And she looked at me, as my mother is wont to do, and said, "Boy, what are you talking about?" I said, "Look, She said, "I don't know who that is or what that book is about, but I named you after my favorite football player." Yeah, and his name, he's known to the world as Dan Pastorini. But Dan, she discovered, was short for Dante, and she loved that sound of that name, and that's how I got my name.
Great. There's Dante and shoulder pads, right? Is that a Philadelphia Eagles player?
I have no idea because I know nothing about football. And he's long since retired. But when I looked him up a few years ago, he was in like a senior division of race car drivers. So he left football and then started doing...
Keeping with the athletics.
Yeah,
nothing
I think that's
like
a good idea.
Race car athletics, you know?
I wish I could be a better namesake because I don't keep up with the
Honey,
athletics.
you've got a namesake. Now, you can't get rid of the name. I'm sorry about that. So right now you're working on a series of poems called Pelham. Where is Pelham?
The Pelham of my poem is in southern Georgia. Yeah, it's a small town outside of another. It's not even a town. It's a small place outside of the town of Camilla. And it happens to be where the maternal side of my family comes from.
So a lot of this poem seems to be about your great-grandmother.
My great-grandmother, my maternal great-grandmother is the protagonist of the poem. I never knew her. She died in 1962. But I know lots of stories about her through my maternal grandmother, who also has passed away. She died in 2012. But when I was 14, I sat down with my grandmother and I just wrote down her memories from her own life of being a girl in the town of Pelham. And she kept a copy of those things. I typed them up on a typewriter and used it as part of a project for school when I was 14 in my world history class. And my grandmother kept a copy of this project that I did, which I got an A on.
Yay.
And she, when she passed away, and I was going through her things, there it was. And I thought I wanted to honor her life by, building out these memories that she had shared with me. And I'm sure she had shared them with other people in the family, but I'm the only writer, so I wrote them down. So I have these wonderful snippets in my 14-year-old typescript of my grandmother just sort of telling me stories, and they become the way I envision the sequence is every other canto of the poem is a pastoral memory from my grandmother, and it's counterbalanced by this fictional narrative where my great-grandmother, who is alive in 1940, is able to communicate with me, who's alive in 2022. And we can communicate with each other, but no one on her side of the time can hear me communicating to her. Only she can hear me. So it's like a voice from somewhere else.
Wow.
Yeah.
So why don't you read us a section, one of your cantos, as you
Sure.
say, and tell, is this a canto that's that is her voice, her memory? Or?
No, the cantos that I'm reading today are the pastoral memories of my grandmother, not the voice of my great-grandmother.
Okay. Well.
So I'll start with the first one. Breeze filled with the sweet smell of big women on the porch, shelling peas, connecting gossip from their houses, miles apart, across the highway from a field of cotton, in their gingham wrappers and calico aprons, high on the small joys of their hard lives, pulling back the string of fat pods, one after the other, emptying true harvest into a single bowl and discarding the fruit in a bucket. Behind the house, corn as high as the roof, a few pens for subsistence livestock, chickens scattered in the manner of their food, and the younger children playing marbles in the dirt, a backdrop of a family's labor and reward. Many children, in fact. 12 boys, 5 grown, though 1 dead, 6 in the field with their father, 2 girls, 1 grown, 14 in all. Little girl holds the baby. The women linger in the work that is easy before the men return, expecting a full meal, the fuel of an afternoon's hoe cake spent. One of the twins hollers, "Papa's comin'," and neighbor ladies say so longs, as Christians never say goodbye. This is the common abundance of the sharecropper.
So this is a poem of memory, and there is such a, somehow it feels like you're walking through a veil into another time, brought there by the rhythms and vocabulary that you use. I really can't say I've ever read anything quite like it. It's as if you're walking into some kind of sepia photograph or something of the old days. You know, you really see and sense this, this picture, this almost like a tableau vivant. You know,
that's how I experienced the stories from my grandmother. My grandmother and I were very, very close. She was the love of my life. And, I spent a great deal of time with her as a young person. And I really am saturated with not only her stories and many of her memories, but also her way of being in the world, the way one carries oneself. And she taught me, I said, I think in the eulogy at her funeral, anything that I can do well, really, and I'm not exaggerating, anything that I can do well, I learned from my grandmother, including writing, because though she didn't teach me poetry, she put a pen in my hand before I started school and taught me how to write my name in cursive. Wow. So really? Before I could print letters, I could write my name in cursive, and that's all due to her. So I really feel as if when I think about her and when I think about the stories that she told me, maybe because she told me when I was so young, they do feel alive. The people are very much alive and speaking and behaving. And my grandmother was a phenomenal storyteller. She could impersonate the voices of her siblings and her parents, and people who would visit the farm. I'm so excited to write the sections. There was a woman who, they didn't have radio or television, or maybe one person in the town had a radio, but they didn't have a radio and they didn't have a television. And so the way they would entertain themselves, besides, children's games and the time that the family spent together, there was a woman who would travel around, a sort of itinerant storyteller. And she would tell scary stories. And my grandmother had this memory of being told the story and being so afraid that they hid under all of the handmade quilts that her mother had made. So I'm really excited to write that. My uncle, the only surviving child of that long list of children that I just...
The 14
of children. The 14 children. My uncle is a well-established painter, and he's 90 years old. So he's the only person left alive who would remember some of this. So I hope to get it all out so he has time to read it.
Wow. So this woman was like a griot,
she was like a griot
of the traveling storytellers of Africa, singer, keepers of the oral tradition.
They would feed her a meal. She'd tell a story and she'd spend time with the family.
Now, were you speaking with her in Pelham?
What was I speaking to? No, my grandmother. No, I grew up in Trenton, New Jersey. Right. My grandmother emigrated from Pelham, I guess you could say, immigrated from Pelham. She moved to the city in 1953. And so she had spent her childhood there. She got married very early. My grandfather was in the military, and so they went off to his military postings. And then they ended up in Trenton, New Jersey.
Have you ever been to Pelham?
I have never been to Pelham, but it's part of this work.
Yes,
part of this work is traveling down there.
It's real. It's real. It's traveling there, except through poetry. Why don't you read us another section?
Sure. Weeds, but welcomed flora, never a remedy waste. Outside the house, a yard. Outside the yard, pens. Outside the pens, a road. Beyond the road, the field and more field. But the last field gives way to wood. Such wood it'd be a wonder. Kudzu, cloaking the squat trees gathered like a congregation hiding its worship, its opening, invisible to the strange eye, reveals a pond's bank, rich with redberry root and sassafras, enough wealth to ward off ailment, collected with care in the fold of an apron, and the little girl's skirt, so pleased with helping her mother carry back that bounty that would be medicine, to wash gently and bind, to hang from a string hung taut against the back wall of the kitchen, to dry, to separate leaf from stem, to crush leaf in hand and sprinkle into the water boiling for tea, or mix into a rendered fat for salve. Though there were other cures that had been shared and miscegenated, committed, brought down and burnished through generations, oil and turpentine, sweet gum or stinking gum, camphor, cherry bark or red oak bark for the gut misery.
Brilliant listing of remedies that seem, so detailed, accurate, and of that place. Also, I'm fascinated with the way that you keep these words so simple and often all one syllables, and yet they knock up against each other like like somebody shaking a medicine cabinet or something, and all the bottles are going at it. It's all the Anglo-Saxon words. There's no Latinate or French in here. It's it seems to me it's all straight ahead. How did you come up with all the names? Was that from talking?
Some of the names are from talking. So my grandmother would tell me, whenever we got a call, Mama would do this, or when it was, too hot outside and people were suffering from heat stroke, Mama would do that. And she would list some of the ingredients, and some of the ingredients I had to research because I wanted to make sure I was talking about flora that exists in and around Pelham. And kudzu is everywhere, it seems, there. But the simple words were intentional. One, because it's germane to the vocabulary that would have been used by the people who are, whose memories these are. And also, I think I can't get away from a more recent influence, and by more recent, I mean maybe the last 15 years or so, of Geoffrey Hill. And so those Anglo-Saxon words, and as you described, the way they knock up against each other, I think come from really spending lots of time inside Geoffrey Hill's poems. And I was privileged to meet him towards the end of his life and take on the care of those words that really evolve in our own language without the very common influence of Latinate words.
Right.
And so, yes, that's purposeful.
Yeah, it sounds like it. It just sounds like it really, makes its purpose. It does its purpose.
Yeah, there is a poet from Louisiana named Jarvis DeBerry. He's a poet and journalist. And when I was a much younger writer, I remember him saying, I made a promise to myself to never write a poem that my grandmother couldn't understand. And I think that memory of him saying that is also present here, to make sure that were my grandmother alive or were my great-grandmother alive, they could access this text.
Definitely. Miscegenated you use in here, a word that is most commonly used for the mixing of the races, but you take it back to its roots and use it. That's a thundering little section there, the way you read it, that had been shared and miscegenated, committed, brought down, and burnished. Boom, 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 in there. Anything, does that set off any thoughts for you? Movement I'm talking about.
I think that something that occurs in my poems, why I can't explain why, but I do have an allegiance to gravitas, and I want readers to look at this work of this woman in particular and know that it was serious, that it was life-sustaining in many cases, and to be the mother of 14 children and a wife of one husband. I'd love to write something about my great-grandfather. Apparently he was a character. She had to be very organized and structured and planful, and that takes a kind of stamina and robustness that I hope the language reflects. Wow. She was out in the Georgia heat collecting these things and then going home and processing them without any machines. So that's serious work.
Committed, brought down and burnished. It's the brought down, you know, that's so down home, you know, but it's those three words together. Can't imagine that happening except with the poet. Exactly. You want to take a stab at another one for us here?
Sure. This is the last section from Pelham that I'll read. Again, it's in the sort of flow of their pastoral lives. One small, sure handful at a time flies the coarser stuff. The little girl makes deft work of feeding chickens the rough sand of corn from a shallow bowl in the crook of her arm. Barefoot, while the ground is still cool, she makes no sound that startles the fowl. No here, chick, 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 chicken, to lure them closer. No running at all when fed well. She learned to keep their meat from turning tough. The hens drift toward the safe food, no fear of competition, and the rooster waits up on the fence to eat right from her hand. Strut, strut, the honor of capon at Christmas. Occasionally she slopped the hogs. Boy's brawn was saved for field work. Potato peels, corn cobs, eggshells, carrot tops, onion skins, apple cores, the stems of collard greens. There was canning to do, seemed like all day preparing fruits and vegetables that could not be cut any which way, not only to fit in jars, but so the pantry would look pretty. Her favorite chore by far was making brooms. Join her brothers in the field when the sun was hot to cut corn straw and hunt for a stick thick as her wrist and high as her plus half. Sweep with the things she made.
Wow. So here's another one of these tableau vivants. This actual scene of the little girl, your grandmother.
My grandmother, yeah.
Out feeding the chickens. But every step of it, it's almost like there ain't no soundtrack here. You know, she knows that if she gets them running, that the meat is going to be tough. She's a scientist,
right.
as well as a poet out there. You know, with her the capon being the honor of capon at Christmas time, and then there's the scene down in the cellar, down in where you keep the jars through the wintertime of the vegetables that you've prepared so perfectly. Not just because that's the way they fit in the jar, but there's an aesthetics involved in it that you point to that I really never thought before. Yeah. These were some notes that you were keeping back when you were in high school.
14, I was a freshman in high school.
Oh, for goodness. You know, like you seem to have done a lot of work as a poet back when you were a very early age.
It is true.
Did you have teachers or anything like that who were helping you, or is it just something natural? Was it your family? What was it?
It was really, poetry came to me naturally, like a lightning bolt. And I remember the exact day it happened, and I have the text in my 12-year-old hand. I was in sixth grade. In the sixth grade, my teacher was this wonderful woman who has since passed away. Her name was Joyce Vereen, and she, as we say and as my grandmother would say, took no tea for the fever. She was a very serious woman. And we had a writing assignment, a prose writing assignment, and all of a sudden, after 3 or 4 paragraphs of prose, I started writing in quatrains. I don't know why. I don't know if I don't have a memory of having experienced quatrains before, but my prose just turned into a poem. And that was the moment that I guess I first wrote a poem. And my teacher, Ms. Vereen, looked at it, and of course she chastised me, and she said, well, this wasn't the assignment, but it's good writing, so I'll accept it. And after that, I started writing things that were in lines. But I really wasn't reading any poetry. I mean, of course, I knew nursery rhymes as a kid, but I didn't have books of poetry in my house. My teacher, who saw that, didn't steer me toward any text. It was really once I got to 8th grade, and I was in a different school, and I remember we had part of the school year we did poetry, and there was an anthology. I think it was called The Sound and the Sense. And
I know that book.
And the
yes.
only poem I remember from that, which I have actually written another poem in conversation with in my first book, Amorous Shepherd, is a poem by Sharon Olds called The Connoisseurs of Slugs. And of course, if you remember that poem or you know what it's about a man getting an erection, or a younger woman seeing an erection for the first time. And of course, we are all in 8th grade. We're 13 years old. So imagine reading that poem and being 13 years old and being totally abashed. And I was writing poems at the same time. And then I met Sonia. And after that, I really started writing poems seriously. She was brilliant. I wrote a poem, which I thought was good at the time. And I sent it to her. I found out she was teaching at Temple University, and I sent it to her. And Sonia is probably the most gracious person. I'm all of 15, 16 years old. She called my school. While I was in class. And she couldn't get me, of course, but she called the school and she left a note, voice message with one of the secretaries in the school office that was then handed to me at the end of the school day saying, "Keep writing those poems. We need your young words."
Whoa!
Yeah.
Sonia Sanchez. The kiss of the poet.
Absolutely.
They just pass it on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It was absolutely the thing that a young writer needs,
Yeah, well, you've now just taken on a job over at Cave Canem.
I have.
The program director.
Mm-hmm.
Well, shout out, first of all, to Toy Derricotte and Cornelius Eady, the founders of the marvelous Cave Canem.
25 years strong.
Wow, that's hard to believe.
Yeah.
So what does Cave Canem mean to you? What place does it have in the Black community?
Cave Canem, I've said this many times, I've written it down, but Cave Canem is really, in the simplest of terms, it's the current phase of a poetic project that started with the Harlem Renaissance, continued with the Black Arts Movement, and there are lots of other schools in there and movements in there. Black Took Collective is one that comes to mind. Umbra. Oh God, yeah, Lorenzo Thomas, and there are many, but we just happen to be the latest phase of that, and I think the thing that makes us different than some of those other movements is that we have been working for a long time to achieve Toy and Cornelius's vision that it really is an institution. Not only are there bricks and mortar, but it's a community that people feel that they can go to. And one of the downsides of becoming an institution is that people on the outside of that institution begin to develop opinions about it, and so there is this thing that part of my job is to work very carefully to try and undo, which is that Cave Canem isn't this ivory tower that people can't access. It's accessible. We have lots of different programs, and so I think people are most familiar with the fellowship, and they want to become Cave Canem fellows, and that's definitely something that is achievable. But we have lots of other programs, and I'm working to expand our programs nationally, so that poets everywhere at any stage can access what we do and be exposed to more kinds of poetry, learn more about the craft, develop their own poetry, and be in their communities, making sure that poetry is very much a part of their communal discourse.
Well, sort of the another type of poem that you write. I was really taken by "I Don't Like Your Cat," and I know it's to make this transition, you just have to be bold and go where people have never gone before. But could you read us that poem? I find it absolutely hilarious.
Sure. I don't like your cat. I don't like your cat. Its diluted wild, or how it makes you cower in submission to its every whim. Its lack of what at first I thought was obedience, but now know to be willful disrespect of my disinterest in it, in photographs of it, in stories about it. Some I love have cats, and so I suffer the onslaught of glycoproteins and claw and baby-voiced, "It's being friendly is all." Feral and decimating the rodent population, one once laid its spoils at my feet, and I admired it. My childhood self even aided a kitten's paw with peroxide and gauze after the animal was nearly obliterated by a speed demon on our street. Admittedly, some have lovely coats, but your cat, black or sphinx or speckled and blue-eyed or piggish or Maine Coon or Scottish fold or mongrel, plots murder under the bed when I visit. It's manipulative and freaks me with guilt, morphing into an emblem of your loneliness every time I look at it.
Oh, gosh. That's a sonnet, Shakespearean sonnet, it feels like, the way you do it. And yet here you are talking, the turn where, like the sonnet's turn, where you talk about it, but your cat, and then of course, you're thinking you're talking about, I don't like your cat, and this cat has done this. You're talking about an individual, but all of a sudden it becomes, you go into one of your lists.
It's all cats, yeah. I mean, the only cats that are excluded from my hatred of cats are the big cats, lions and tigers and snow leopards especially, and the jaguar is especially dear to me. But these domesticated cats, I have no time for whatsoever.
Please, people, this ROM is going to get us more. We're going to get more emails on this one, more feedback from you. I think this is possibly the first anti-cat poem, and certainly the first person on our podcast. Come on.
Well, someone has to do it. I mean, someone has to do it. Have you encountered cat people? They are zealous.
Well, don't bring it back on me now. You're the one who's saying all this.
I did. I said it. I stand by it.
I love that line. Admittedly, some have lovely coats. It's as if you're talking about some Hollywood starlet or something. Oh, well, she does have a nice coat, I guess you'd say. Yeah. Oh, goodness. Some poetry for you today, folks. Dante Micheaux, thank you for visiting us here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Poetry is bread. Loved this wonderful poems coming up from these fantastic Pelham outside Camilla, someplace in southern Georgia. Thank you very much, Dante.
Thank you.
Late 2019 was my first trip to the homeland of Pablo Neruda, who gave us the name Poetry is Bread. I visited several of his houses. I even went to Rapa Nui, Easter Island, where Neruda wrote the poetry sequence, The Separate Rose, which is the long way around to our guest today from Chile, Rodrigo Rojas, translator from Mapuche, who I last saw in Santiago with the aroma of tear gas in the air and another revolution on the streets. I participated in an impromptu poetry performance, or was it a party, Rodrigo?
I can't tell the difference.
Yeah, I think it was both, yeah, or at least the same. He's an MFA graduate from NYU, where he's on a Fulbright, author of several volumes in Spanish, translator, as I said, from the Mapuche language, indigenous Chile, Argentina, and he's now trying his hand at English. Please welcome Rodrigo Rojas.
Thank you, Bob. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, I'm glad you could accept it and visit us here in the largest studio in the world, my back room. Listen, right at the beginning, what was it that caused you to start thinking you were a poet? Tell me what poems or poem gave you the inspiration to think, hey, maybe I can do that?
Well, to be honest, it wasn't an actual poem. It was a series of novels about the sea right to the west of Patagonia. His name is Francisco Huichaqueo. He writes a lot about the whales and all the animals on land and the natives there. And those were my first very passionate readings when I was young, I don't know, 12 to 14. And
so it was images
yes,
that struck you.
Images, and it was this relationship with the sea, with nature. And I had the opportunity to visit that place, and I got a job as a teenager, and
What were you doing?
I was working for a fishing company, and then I worked as a cook in this small fishing boat. I was a horrible cook, and I didn't know anything about it. But the people from the fishing boat, they wanted me to work there because for them it was really funny to see my mistakes, and I was so enthusiastic, and I loved the sea, and I started a journal. And a couple of years after that, and when I read the journal, I realized that in fact I was writing poetry. So I came to poetry without looking for it, without knowing that I was inside of a poem. And it was a means to trying to understand my surroundings.
That's another line of Neruda's, of course. Poetry came in search of me, Chile has such an incredible poetic tradition, and so many political poets as well. Extraordinary poets like Huidobro, Neruda, Parra, Gabriel Mistral, Raúl Zurita, one of our favorites.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, it reminds me of the Nuyorican poets here, the Nuyorican Poets Cafe, and poets like Pedro Pietri, Tito Laviera, Sandra Maria Esteves, Miguel Pinheiro, and Algarín, so many others. What do you think it is that creates these pockets of poetry, or a poetic tradition that seems to like overflow the language from the poet to the people?
I really don't have an accurate answer, but I have an experience relating to that. I can understand what happens when in a certain country or a certain community, there are certain troubles and there is certain anguish, and suddenly words begin to have a different effect. And that effect is not related directly to intelligence or directed towards aesthetic experience. Those words begin to thread different levels of experience and different levels of imagination, and also they bring about a new perspective of the future. And if that is not political, I don't know what it is.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Have you got a poem that you can give us? This was supposed to be a translation issue, so if you can read a poem in Spanish and English, that you think?
I will. Okay. I will. And I've got this one. Her name is Elbir Hernandez, and she belongs to the same generation as the poet Raúl Zurita, who you have just mentioned. She's a very, very discreet and quiet poet. She must be turning 70 very soon. And she published her first book called La Bandera de Chile, Chilean Flag, in 1982. That book could not come out because it was 1982. That was in the middle of the dictatorship. Yeah. The secret police got word of this book. And because she mentioned the Chilean flag, so the dictators tend to be very nationalistic, and they tend to control the symbolism around these national emblems. And that was her project, to take this back. And well, that book never came out the press, and somehow she managed to type this thing and reproduce it, not in photocopies. I can remember the name of that very low cost reproduction, which with a jelly
mimeograph.
Oh, mimeograph.
Yeah, that's a samizdat means of distribution here in the U.S. as well.
Yeah,
whole generation of mimeograph.
So
poets.
When I read this poem, I was still a teenager. Pinochet was still in power, and I had in my hands like this copy, this it's so full of grit and history. It's so difficult to read. And that made the poem,
sacred text.
yes, so believable.
Yeah.
And when I came back to this poem, I was living here in New York, and I was part of the MfA and NYU. So I translated it in order to share it with my friends. And it was the beginning of the Iraq War. It was right after 9/11.
George W. Bush, your president.
Yes, George W. Bush. And I saw the same phenomenon around the flag. I understand what happened here. Well, I lived it after 9/11. And I saw every house with a flag. But I could read that the same symbol meant so many different things.
Mm-hmm.
Some people were proud, some people were sad, but many were hiding behind the flag because they were scared of their own neighbors too. And that reminded me of that experience. So that's when I translated this poem. And instead of saying the Chilean flag, I translated, it's a long poem, I'll read just a little bit. I translated as the flag of the nation. So whichever nation
right
feels close to this poem, they can, replace Chile by the name of their country. Okay, so it goes like this. No se dedica uno la bandera de Chile, se entrega a cualquiera que la sepa tomar, la toma de la bandera. Nadie ha dicho una palabra sobre la bandera de Chile en el porte, en la tela, en todo su desierto cuadrilongo. No la han nombrado la bandera de Chile ausente. La bandera de Chile no dice nada sobre sí misma. Se lee en su espejo de bolsillo redondo. Espejea retardada en el tiempo como un eco. Hay muchos vidrios rotos, trizados como las líneas de una mano abierta. Se lee en búsqueda de piedras para sus ganas. The flag of this nation is not dedicated to a single person, but given just to anyone who's able to learn how to snatch it. The seizing of la bandera. No one has said a word on the flag, on its size, on the fabric, in all its square-lory desert. It hasn't been mentioned. The flag of the nation is absent. The flag doesn't say a thing about itself. It reads itself in a round pocket mirror, mirroring time like a retarded echo, or piles of broken glass splintered like the lines of an open hand. It reads itself in search of stones to fulfill its desires. Unto the flag, a fatherly Orient ignorance, no matter what bitch gave birth to her. Honors are given to her that multiply the infallible mechanisms, the unnoticed flag there. 100, 200, 900. In no one has the territory of its own empty lots. In no one has the fossil of its communal pot. In no one, until it's enough of colors and threads. No one has, one has not, no one has, one has not, none are. The national flag is torn into little flags for children to cheer.
Oh.
Wow. She's this very discreet and quiet lady, and she has like this atomic thing bubbling in her.
Absolutely. That's, it's so great to say, what do dictators do? Well, they steal the symbols, turn the symbols into themselves, and it's the poet's job to demystify the symbols, to reinvent them as their origins once they get a passage. Now, you say you've changed the title of this poem, though. How do you have the liberty to go ahead and change the title of a poem? Doesn't the poet, aren't they in charge here? Who are you?
Well, I had a long chat with her.
Oh, okay. But that changes. And I think that's really an important issue. If the poet is alive, to not be in touch with the poet while you're doing the translation, I think is to miss the boat.
Yeah. I had a chat with her after translating it, because if I would have asked permission, she would have said no. I would have said no too. But then I came up with this poem and I sent it to her, and she said, okay, come and have, a cup of tea with me. We went from tea to wine, and with a prolonged conversation, and she made me read it to her.
Mm-hmm.
Because some lines, I expanded them with repetition in order to replace certain local themes. So when a footnote was needed, I replaced it with another kind of, compensation in English language. Okay. Sometimes it was alliteration, sometimes it was repetition. And I, underlined these things, and we talked each one through. And some of them she didn't like. I took them out, and some of them she did. And one thing she said, whenever you read this poem, feel free to change it while you're reading it, because your version is more performative than my version in Spanish.
Yes, and I and you get that when you can add a repetition. Now that's orality on the hoof, repetition. It's it's repetition actually that passes a poem along to another person, as well as the call and response, which is a poetic technique, ancient oral technique, and so. You do that to have permission. I think all poets should have permission to change any poem. Now, I don't know if you want to change Shakespeare, but maybe you don't have permission to change other people's poems, but you do from me. But you certainly have permission to change your own poems as you read them, because the audience wants to hear the way you're relating to them right now.
To be honest, Bob, I think that I agree with you, but I think that we should start with Shakespeare. Shakespeare is not holy. And if there's anyone who taught us to steal and change things, is Shakespeare. Yeah. Hamlet is this great play, but that play was written by somebody else before him. In fact, it was staged a year before by his competitors. And, the thing is that when you're living next to a Shakespeare, it's terrible, because you write something very good, and he steals it from you, and he makes it better. Like, I don't know, for example, Caetano Veloso, he takes songs from all over the world, and he turns them all into this soft, mellow Caetano Veloso.
Walking the Brazilian beaches.
Yeah, come on. And you hear like Nirvana in Caetano's voice, and you say, oh my God. So, that's great.
Yeah.
It's great. So
that's what
I agree with you, moves. But we shouldn't even respect
You're right. I get, okay, you win the prize. You're wearing the hat, and you look like it, Let's see, where can we go from here? We talk about the orality. Let's talk about the Mapuche traditions, okay, which are grounded in orality. Now, how did you get involved with the Mapuche poetry?
Okay, so, yes, one clarification. I do translations, and I have studied the Mapuche language, but I would never call myself a translator directly from Mapuche. Because one thing that is happening now in Chile is that these Mapuche people, who have, 500,000 of them are Mapuche speakers or bilingual speakers, they are reclaiming their position in culture. And the Mapuche that I learned was thanks to the poet Leonel Lienlaf. He did these workshops called, Mapuche Worldview. And he placed in the center of the table like a bread to be shared,
Yeah.
his kimun, which is his knowledge. And I learned from him. And that allows me to use skillfully certain dictionaries and the phone, because I can call other friends and understand certain variations. And I bring those poems into English. But many of these Mapuche poets are approaching the task of the self-translation. So what I've done is that I have studied them as translators of their own work.
Okay.
And I have read into that activity a strategy of profound political meaning. In a summary, they take the language that has been imposed, they learn it, they extract what they need, and then they use that strength against the very same language that so for example, you have wonderful Mapuche poets who have taken Neruda and translated it into Mapuche, transforming his poetry. Like we were talking about Shakespeare now, well, they've done it with Neruda. So they have dressed Neruda as a Mapuche. So what I do is that I translate certain poems in order to share them with my poet friends.
No.
So
yes.
I'm spreading or pollinizing this.
Yeah, it's pollinating. Yeah, but it's exactly, it's what the oral tradition is. It's what Mapuche, where the poems came from, was being spoken to around the fire at night or on the ayahuasca or whatever is going on.
And Cecilia Vicuña is the first one that pushed this agenda into English. And all I did is just follow her thread. Anyone who knows Cecilia Vicuña,
I was going to say they're her kipas. It's a pun on the way that she makes her art with a thread. Now, so the Mapuche translations. Can you read Mapuche?
Yeah.
Can we hear it from you? Would you feel comfortable with that?
Look, I can read Mapuche, but to be honest, I wouldn't like to do it now because there's this. No, I don't want to take up the space that they're building for themselves. Okay. So I called Lionel and I asked him to send me an audio file with him reading his own text. But unfortunately, his mother has just died. So I didn't want to insist. So but I have another version of another poet. His name is Jaime Wanoon. And Jaime, he comes from a family in which they were forced to forget their language. So through formal Western education, he came in contact with poetry. And while writing poetry, he realized that certain things, certain words, he could only say them in Mapuche. Not because he didn't know the Spanish word for it, but he needed the construction of syntax, of the worldview of Mapuche. So he writes in a Spanish that seems extracted from the 17th century, which is the time in which the Mapuches and the Spaniards clashed. So even though he doesn't write in Mapuche, his Spanish calls upon that void of violence, which made him and his family forget that tongue. So he has a huge project that started in Chile. Now it's around the world with other native poets who have been deprived of their language. So he does these beautiful illuminated anthologies. And he refers by illumination to that light and also to the shadow, which comes in that, very strange threshold in which you're forced to speak in the language that has oppressed you and your people for generations and turn that violence into poetry. So let me read you this thing.
Let's hear this thing.
Okay, so this this poem is called Ceremony of Love. Okay. Ceremony of Love. Last night trees loved each other like Indians. Mañío, Ulmo, Pellín, and Guaye, Tineo, and Lingue, node to node, they loved as great lovers do. Peumos, bronze-barked, coihues, muched, kissed their roots, tufts, and sprouts, until love was aroused in birds already lulled by feathers of their very own twittering love. The same way filthy Wincas, like lovers, buried themselves, and the Negro waters opened their springs to bring light, sip by sip alone, naming, calling out gentle and beautiful waters. But oh, we were raped. Our river waters, Pilmaiken River moaning, bloomed in labor, and yet joyous lady streams that crossed the hills and mountains like hares. And doves of the same love soon gathered under one yoke, the green wellspring of Inayao, the wild honey, Waikipan, swift eye, Yanakilef, thrush breasts, Requeleo, the Quillay, Huilitraro, blackbird hair, the young beech trees, Pailamanque, Huiche love. Last night they made love again in a plain Negro thicket under threshed perpetually Indian skies. Like mountains they made love, like stallion waters, like flaming and chimalen flowers. In a fragrant dawn they loved, sweetening their yeast like overflowing vessels of Mudai liquor. So that strangeness of these words, that they sound so foreign, they are just as foreign in Spanish. And these Mapuche words, he's mixing name places, he's mixing objects of the natural world with family names.
Oh.
So
which family names?
Oh,
or is it just to indicate all people through a last name, to bring the people into the poem?
He's bringing people into the poem, but
specific or not specific?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, yeah. Yanakilef, for example. Okay, so he's saying swift eye Yanakilef, which is the physical characteristic of that family, but. He's saying also that the Yanakilef family cannot be distinguished from the river, from the tree, from the stone. There's no boundary between human and their natural surroundings.
Beautiful.
Beautiful.
And I've never heard of that, of that, what do you call it? Technique, strategy. There's no word for it. But consciousness is the word I'm searching for, where the human takes their place with their name the same way that the river does, and the same way the plants do, and the same way that the jaguar does, and everybody is living in balance. Everybody is in balance.
Yes, and that is this is an erosion of the notion of property, because one of the political projects that failed with the resistance of the Mapuche is the notion of owning the land. Because what they now confront, the confrontation with the state is that, you are forcing us to live under a productive paradigm. And the productive paradigm means that your relationship with the earth, with the soil, is to produce. And that's the only way to show that you are a responsible owner. And we understand that you cannot own something that is undistinguishable from people, from other living beings. And to be productive in that sense means to let nature do what nature does best. And that's all in that poem.
That's, well, we can feel it now. We can feel it. But how it gets started with the actual dropping in of the Mapuche words that just make us stop and what did he, was that part, is it Spanish or, all of that goes on, especially when we hear it in English, especially, I think probably more with people around who live with the Mapuche down in Chile.
And he uses the word Indian and the word Negro.
Okay.
Because he's taking those words which are used as insults and he transforms them into the poem, in which they sound to your ear as insult, and yet they participate in a ceremony of love.
Wow. Okay, I'm glad you broached that, because I was thinking, hey, am I going to bring this up that you can't say Negro anymore? Outdated, old-fashioned, and an insult. Indian, I don't know. Well, I know a lot of Indians who call themselves Indians, but we'll call them indigenous. We'll call them Native Americans or Native wherever we are. Whatever,
but he chooses purposely those words.
All right.
He wants that negative energy transformed in the poem. It's explosive.
Powerful. Yes, yeah. Explosive indeed. So the translations of the Mapuche occur in a conversation like this after the poem is read, I would assume. And that's what's important about this podcast, is that we're able to sort of dig into the poem and find out how this consciousness results in a kind of aesthetic. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm more familiar with Welsh, where you have poets like Gerard Manley Hopkins and Dylan mm-hmm. Thomas, who used Welsh formal poetic devices, the kanhana, to drive the rhythms of the poems. But this is different. I like it that you said they're forced to forget. I've never heard that used before. I've heard they were not allowed to speak their language, and people having to wear a dunce cap or some kind of a plaque around their necks when they weren't allowed to speak the language, but they did. But you say forced to forget. Could you tell us, what does that mean?
Well, because one thing is that image that you have just placed in our minds, the dunce cap, etc. And that happens in one generation. But the effect of that is that you become ashamed of your own culture. And that's the true effect of that violence. So what you inherit to the next generation is that shame. So the triumph of the colonial project has to do with people who are ashamed of being themselves. And they are forced into that position. And the result is in the realms of memory. So that's why I say they are forced to forget. Mm. Because it's forgetfulness, not because, I don't know, you forgot. Like it happens to me with the keys in the morning. Right. It's not that. It's the result of a long-winded political project through which a national state is built. And it's built by not only by hiding a language, but by having a whole part of its population afraid to be themselves. They think of themselves as not intelligent, not capable, that they have a certain secret that they must expunge from their bodies, even like the color of their hair, the color of the skin, everything is there. Yeah. And the total triumph is within the language, because then you make them, you make them ashamed even of their worldview, their imagination, their dreams.
You take away their identity, basically, to take away a language. The Chilean government is finally, I understand, beginning to support some Mapuche in schools. Is that happening?
Yes, it's a project that has begun. They are supporting multicultural medicine and some projects with bilingual education, but it's not enough. To this moment, it's just makeup. And And we have in our hands a problem that has not been solved. And we've had right-wing, left-wing, center governments that have been blind and very clumsy with this problem. And one of the reasons is that the Mapuche have not truly participated in this process. And that is because the Mapuche have also another type of time and another type of organization that the Western mindset cannot stand that. Like, for example, okay, tell me, who is your leader? Tell him to come and speak to us. And they answer, well, we'll send you a leader, but we have so many. We have so many. And okay, so we have 1 month to solve this. And they say, well, I don't know, we haven't solved this in 500 years. Like, how about if we take another 500 to talk about this?
Oh, wow. Yeah. Oh, incredible. So, so steeped in the Mapuche culture, and yet here you are in New York, and having gone to NYU and studied the American poets. What drew you to America? This hotbed of antipathy and violence.
Well, I don't know. I've had a life, in a sense that, well, my life has been a mess, a mosaic. Okay, and the Mapuche is just one piece, a very golden, shining piece of that mosaic. And my relationship with the English language also, and my relationship with my Spanish, it's also another piece of this mosaic. I have a very fractured identity, and I think that New York is one of the places in the world in which a fractured identity is an asset. And that's where I came. And yes, it's filled with violence, and it has a very rich tradition that can be questioned. And I found that my own interests and my own insolence could be valued here. So that's where I am. So I don't even know where I'm really standing. I write in Spanish, and I love all my books are in Spanish, but I also write in English.
I know, that's what I was going to ask you about, the exercises in infidelity, you call them. It doesn't sound like you're very faithful to any language to me, but
yeah.
In Spanish is mother tongue for you. Do you have one of those poems in English that you can read?
Yes, I have. Look, when the pandemic started, friends from NYU got together and did this workshop through Zoom. And since, I don't know, we were together in the MFA 20 years ago, all of them were living in different cities, even in different countries. And so we got through this pandemic by writing every Saturday. And if I wanted to participate, of course, I had to write again in English, and it was a great exercise for me. So I will read you this poem that, like every poem in this collection is about a different kind of translation. Their poems are very aware of the difference, or transporting, or trying to cross a threshold. And sometimes it's a linguistic, or in many times it's just cultural. And this is about an activity that I really love. I think by drawing. I've always done that. It gives me another pacing for my ideas. I'm a very anxious person. So when I draw, I become treatable. And when I draw, I understand the flowing of ideas, also the hierarchy of ideas, but a hierarchy that responds not to logic, but responds to the aesthetic understanding of what I'm looking at. And this is a poem about that. It's called Fine, Soluble, and Light Fast. It's Indian, it's English, West Indian in Dutch, but in German, French, and Spanish, it's Chinese ink. solid black, thick water dark, no gloss, but still a journey. I opened a 16-ounce bottle, poured some of the ink into a glass bowl, dipped a number 8 flat brush until it became heavy. The night is approaching. A brush soaked in black is necessary. The hairs must bend and slightly spread over the white of the paper. The outline of the garden is first, not the sky. The proximity of night means that darkness will rise in between the plants. It's your everyday shadow, but swelling. The brush loaded will leave a wide stroke with some bubbles expanding the same way shadows flood into each other. A mass deep enough to rise from the ground. 13 minutes ago, the sunset, red afterglows are dissolved. This nectary blue sky, uneven, concave, unlit, is the source of all contrasts. Nothing falls through that edge, the line of night closing in. The flat brush allows in one movement to do the spines, little teeth aligned at the side of fleshy leaves against the horizon. They could be a cuff of a sperm whale, its lower jaw out of the water with its first open vowel. One brush stroke, one Indian stroke, one Chinese solid black ink, the paper and its tide is oblivious to the weight of the exotic in its name, but the brush dips into all of that as it paints on from wet soil to the spiky tips. Night falls in broiled blue, darkness swelling from the ground, the unconfessed imagination, uncivilized mirror subdued in 16-ounce bottle made in the Netherlands.
Bravo, bravo! A poem that paints. This is the poem itself is drawing itself. You have described as only a poet can everything from filling up a brush with India ink or Chinese ink, making that brush stroke, and at the same time telling us a sunset. Come on, man, that's a fool's errand there to tell us how a sunset goes down, and when we're supposed to see it, of course we do through your words. Beautiful, incredible poem. I mean, it also has the real political edge, the way you have the countries at the beginning, and starting with Indian, and then going to West Indian and relaxing that word, ending up back in the Netherlands, where we, where the colonization of so much of this. Of that part of the world happened. Bravo, and your English attempt sounds like it is indeed kind of unfaithful. That was Exercises in Infidelity, one of the poems from that series. One of the other things I've heard about you is that you can actually translate, or Jaguar. Could perhaps we hear some of your Jaguar translations?
Oh, yes. I've been working on this Jaguar translation, and I will try to render one line of a Jaguar poem, and the audience should be aware that this line has some internal rhymes. So it starts something like this. That's as far as
beautiful translation. I've heard that you've translated that into Dolphin Speak.
Yes. I'm starting with Dolphin Speak, and I will eventually get to human language. But Dolphin, they are so empathic, so it's a perfect middle language. See, because a dolphin would express that poetry line like this. There are some variations to that depending on what kind of dolphin, but the basic part.
Can hardly wait until you translate the Mapuche into jaguar and dolphin. Well, but thank you, Rodrigo, for visiting the Bowery studio all the way from Santiago, Chile. Safe travels to you. I'm Bob Holman, and thank you for listening to Poetry is Bread. Subscribe to our podcast to get notifications of new episodes, or check us out at bowerypoetry.com. The podcast is co-produced by Ram Devnini and Flavia Roja with Rattapallax. This podcast series is funded by the Citizen Diplomacy Action Fund, which is sponsored by the U.S. Department of State, can you believe it? With funding provided by the U.S. government and implemented by Global Ties U.S. in partnership with the Office of Alumni Affairs in the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. Additional support from New York State Council on the Arts, Governor of New York State, and the New York State Legislature. Okay, see ya.
See you.